Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Thank you for joining for our next edition of our IP Speaker Series as part of the Accelerate IP program. My name is Bradley. I'm the Education Program Manager at New Ventures BC. Again, welcome to everyone here. A big thank you to our hosts and guests. So we have Byron Thom hosting us and Roch Ripley as our guests for today for our topic of strategies on patent focus. Just some brief housekeeping before I hand it over to Byron. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave them in the chat. We'll try to get through as many as we can over the course of the series. In addition, if you want to have your cameras on, you're more than welcome to. Always encourage that for engagement, but if you want to have them off, that's okay as well. Please keep yourself on mute unless we want some more clarification on a question, just so we can keep things moving right along. But I'll hand it over to Byron to get us started.
Great, thanks, Bradley. And thanks to New Ventures BC for hosting this webinar series. This is the third in a series of several that will be happening over the next year that are focusing on different IP topic areas. Before I introduce my guest, maybe I'll just quickly introduce the session. Today's discussion will be a fireside chat talking about patent focus. Right, as we think about overall strategic planning from an IP perspective, how and where you want to focus your dollars on particular patents is a key consideration for many startups and scale-ups in our space. And so we thought we'd bring in an expert to kind of explore some of the considerations that different companies should be thinking about as they're looking to allocate budget towards patent filings. I'll introduce myself quickly. My name is Byron Thom. I'm a partner at the BDC Industrial Innovation Venture Fund. This is a $250 million fund investing broadly across industrial innovation, including sector-specific areas of Industry 4.0, ag tech, food tech, and technologies directed towards extractive sectors, including oil and gas, mining, forestry, and oceans. Before I introduce our guest speaker today, I'd like to respectfully acknowledge that we're gathered here today on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. And I know we have people joining from across BC, and so want to respectfully acknowledge the traditional caretakers of those lands as well. Maybe right now I'll introduce our guest speaker, Roch Ripley. Roch is a partner at Gowling, but rather than me introduce him, I'll just hand it over to him to give his own bio. Roch, welcome.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for having me, everybody. I'm happy to speak here today. So, I mean, my bio, I have been with Gowling WLG for, I guess, almost 20 years now. I started as a student in 2005. Before that, I went to law school, and before that, I did a degree in electronic engineering. So that sort of very naturally dovetails with intellectual property law. That's what I've exclusively practiced for almost the last 20 years. The bulk of that practice has been patent work. So all the stuff we'll be talking about today. And I'd say, about a quarter to a third of my practice is more traditional lawyering or commercialization. So a lot of that will be helping clients as they take these patents and then try to go through due diligence to acquire money or to get sold. Or if, problems arise, litigation support, doing deals like licensing, things like that. So that's me in a nutshell.
Great. Thanks for that. As Bradley mentioned, we have a set of questions that we're going to kind of go through today, exploring this topic of patent focus. But if there are any questions that come up during the conversation, please do include them in the chat. We'll try to cover them as much as we can, and we'll save a little bit of time at the end to go through things that we didn't have an opportunity to incorporate into the conversation. So to start off with, maybe let's just have a high-level kind of discussion about patent focus and some of the different considerations that startups and scale-ups need to think about. What does patent focus mean, right, when we use that broadly, and why does it matter when you're preparing a patent application?
So, yeah, let's start at the beginning. Patent focus means you are going to protect your technology using patents. And what is a patent? So fundamentally, a patent is a bargain that you make with the government. And the bargain is that you are going to tell the government or the world how to make and use your invention, which is defined as something that's new, no one else has ever done it before, non-obvious, even if no one else has done it. Is the difference between what you've done and what everyone else has done, is that difference big enough to warrant being granted a patent, and useful? Just does it technically work? The government's, in this instance, not cared about is it going to be commercially successful. For the purposes of a patent, you're just worried about, is it actually gonna function? So the patent bargain is you tell the whole world how to make and use your invention, and in exchange for that, you get a time-limited 20 years from filing exclusive right to make and use the invention yourself. And when that right expires, the whole world can do what it wants. So a patent focus is for a certain class of your technology, and we'll talk more about this soon, that you decide to protect with patents as opposed to, for example, keeping it secret. You're going to work on preparing and filing this application, trying to figure out how to which jurisdictions to file in, and when and how to stagger costs associated with that.
Great, thanks. So maybe let's talk about, since you are an engineer and I'm one as well, I should also say that this is an area of law. As a lawyer, or as a former lawyer, something that I did spend a lot of time in and do help a lot of my portfolio companies with. But talk about how the technology aspect is really important to this, and having counsel that's focused on certain areas may be more useful to you as you're looking to kind of set up a fence around your particular innovation.
Yeah, absolutely. So the technology is important because this is an area of law where the person helping you has to understand the technology. And that means that, for example, with my degree in electronic engineering, I am not going to be drafting ever a pharmaceutical patent or working in life sciences spaces. That stuff I will get help with from colleagues. And why is it important in substance? I mean, I think for a couple of reasons. So one, when you're working with a patent lawyer, you're going to have discussions about what is protectable in your technology, how the scope of your technology compares to what other people have created, how you might find out whether other people have copied or are using your technology. And all of that really requires an actual understanding of the technology if you want a valuable interactive conversation. Otherwise, the conversation's entirely one-sided and you're not getting a lot of value there. And then when it comes to actually drafting the application, all those concepts have to be expressed in words, the right words. And a general rule of patent law is that all the things that you put in a patent application, the audience is what we call the skilled person. So a typical engineer or computer scientist or what have you, technically trained person in the field. So you want to work with someone who has sort of a fundamental understanding of what that language is. So you're not telling them about, current voltage transformers, neural networks, what have you. You can focus on sort of the value add, higher level stuff.
Yeah. And I think this is an important part to clarify in this conversation as well is, and you and I talked about this beforehand, is we're going to talk about things that are applicable generally across all of the different sectors of technology. But there will be questions come up that we may not address that are more focused on biosciences or life sciences or chemistry. And so I guess just as a reminder that for your particular startups, for those people on the call today, if you are in the life sciences, some of this discussion will be a little bit more nuanced if you're coming from those particular fields, because there are considerations that are specific to those types of technologies. I would also say, obviously, and I speak of this as an investor, understanding market is also important, right? Because there's the specification, right? And there's the background that talks about the overall market and what the technologies there are doing. And then there's the claims. And so maybe let's just dive into that a little bit. When we talk about patent focus, how does that divide kind of come up into consideration?
Okay, so that divide between the specification and the claims, they serve two different purposes. So what I just said earlier, like a couple minutes ago, was that the patent bargain is you tell the world how to make and use your invention in exchange for that exclusive right to practice your invention for 20 years. So the part where you tell the world how to make and use the invention, that's the specification. You pick up a patent, you flip through it, the bulk of that is going to be specification. You flip through it, you read it, all those words, all the stuff that reads like a paper, all the figures, that specification. And then you get to the very end of it, there's a series of numbered paragraphs there, which reads very technically, very legal easy. And those are the claims. So the claims are what define your exclusive right. And that distinction is important because you can disclose something in the specification, but if you don't claim it, you have no protection over it. You just told the world out of the goodness of your heart that technology works. I can describe the claim for cancer, but if I don't claim it, I get no protection over it. And similarly, if you're on the wrong end of a cease and desist letter, I get lots of people will come in and they'll say, hey, this person I never heard of is saying I infringed their patent, but I've gone through it. They're using these very particular equations to do X, Y, Z. I don't use those equations. I can't infringe their patent. But then you go and you look at the claims. Those equations are in the specification. But you look in the claims, and the broad claims, which are called the independent claims, those aren't limited to those particular equations, right? The independent claims may say, you're detecting motion of a face on a screen, period. And the specification may say, here are some example equations you can use to detect motion. Maybe find the center of mass of the image of the person on the screen and track that. But if that's not what the claims are limited to, that's not what the scope of protection is limited to. So that is useful to know both ways, when you're applying and if someone is saying you infringe.
Yeah, interesting. And those are talking about broad, and I think we'll go into kind of claims a little bit, but I think that's where we're going to spend the bulk of this conversation, because so much of the value of a patent are around kind of the claim sets. And so you mentioned having broad independent claims, and then there's also dependent claims that allow you to narrow to maybe to that specific algorithm or that specific equation that you had mentioned. And so maybe just broadly, and we're not talking about patents in general, but we are talking about patent focus, but just because you did mention the connection between the specification and the claims, how you would do so using dependent claims.
So the way this usually works is that if you've invented something, you've got a particular example of an invention, right? You may say, I mean, let's use a simple example. I've got a mouse here. There we go. And let's say you're the first person to invent a mouse, and you say, hey, you know what? I've got this mouse. You move it on the desk, and it controls a cursor. And the way you have to find a way to track the movement. So I've got a little mouse ball in there. I'm sorry, I'm dating myself. I've got a little mouse ball in there that rolls, and there's some sensors in there, and that'll track where the mouse moves. I want to patent this. That is what we call an example. You see this word a lot in patents, an example embodiment, a particular instance of your invention. So then we'll have this conversation with you, right? We'll say, okay, what's really the core of this invention? You've got a device which you control with your hand on a table. You move it, that controls the cursor on the screen. Does it really matter how it tracks the motion? Do you have to use the ball? Doesn't seem like it's a good solution, but it doesn't seem like the best solution. It'll get dirty. You have to clean it. Are there other ways to do it? And then we'll have that conversation, and you may say, actually, there are other ways to do it. We could put a little laser there. We could have a little camera there. And then we can monitor motion using the camera and the laser as opposed to a ball. And then we say, great. So when we're drafting the claims then, in the specification, we'll focus then on what you've actually invented, that is the ball. We'll mention you could do it in other ways, such as using a camera. And then in the claims, the broadest claims, because for example, could just say, you've got a handheld pointing device that tracks motion when you move the pointing device on a table or on a surface, right? And that would capture any kind of mouse, regardless of whether you're using a ball or a laser or something else. And then a dependent claim, which is a fallback position in case an examiner doesn't want to give you the broad protection, or in case you go to enforce a patent and it turns out that broad claim isn't new because someone else has done it before and you didn't know, you can fall back to your narrower examples, a mouse with a ball, a mouse with a camera, which will claim in dependent claims, and still have that specific example of protection in case you need it because you can't get the broad protection.
Yeah. And so we see this a lot when we're looking at technology companies, because you've created a specific type of invention, right? But then you always try to abstract away in order to get broader claims. And I guess, like, from an obviousness perspective, like, you want to create as broad as possible, because once it's issued, you have the ability to then enforce your patent, a broad patent application, against more people than if you're only being very specific against your specific embodiment. Interesting. And so I guess, and then this is something that I did a lot when I was drafting patents, but maybe talk a little bit about like that process of working with an inventor and working with a company. It's almost like you're co-inventing sometimes because they have a particular embodiment that they are trying to bring to market. But how important is it for you, and how often do you work with clients and say, okay, well, could you do it other ways? And like, should we try to claim more or less?
Yeah, I mean, do it all the time. That's part of the job, right? I would
Mhm.
say that is just what you do when you're working on these applications, and that's one reason why it is very helpful to have the appropriate technical background, right? It's not just in my job where I'll read about this stuff. Like I expect many of you, I read about a lot of tech for fun because I find it interesting. So, clients will come and they'll say, I've invented this and it's brand new. No one else has ever done it. Usually someone else has done something close. But the very first thing I'll say is, you can do a search, or you can say, well, what about the stuff in the news? Yeah, have you thought about how perhaps this technology could apply to a different area? Do we have to worry about what these people have been doing? You've got AI, of course, is a huge topic right now. Lots of papers, lots of articles on that. So people will talk about improvements or customizations they've done to LLMs. And then just by virtue of staying up to date in the space, you can say, well, what about these other LLMs? You're using a transformer that's better than an RNN. Why? Could you abstract it away from that? What is the next one coming down the pipeline? How many parameters? What is large in a large language model? Does it matter for you, right? Stuff like that. So those are all that's, I mean, a very small snippet of the back and forth you have when you're talking with an inventor. You just are basically trying to get to the true understanding of what the underlying invention is, and then figuring out if you're going to limit that in some way. Is the client, would the client be okay with that limitation, right?
Mhm.
Because you don't want a situation where you limit the patent to something. Like going back to my very simple mouse example, if we didn't have that conversation and I just limit the independent claim to a tracking device with a ball in it, and then someone comes and creates an alternative, and the client comes back and says, hey, this is the same basic idea, right? So I could sue them because they've created a mouse with a laser. And I don't want to be in a position where where I said we didn't talk about that, and that's not actually captured within the scope. So that back and forth is really going to what's the core inventive element? How broad can we capture that so that we go above the one particular example you may have developed? Let's include those examples, and let's make sure it's not limited by anything else that's not required to establish that your invention is inventive and new over what other people have done.
Yeah. And I think, and we talked about this a little bit, but the different types of claims and how that can also help broaden who potential infringers are. And so maybe let's just talk a little bit about different claim types. Like let's focus on the mouse, because I think that is an interesting one, right? Right now, you've talked about an apparatus claim, right? Having a particular hardware components. But what are some other ways, right, from a focus perspective that you could claim, right, the usefulness of a mouse, right? And why, I think, is the important part.
Right. So typically, if you can get an apparatus claim, like a claim for the actual thing, that is a very valuable claim. That's the kind of claim you want. And that is largely because of discoverability of infringement, right? So ideally, you want to be in a space where if someone is infringing your patent, you know about it, and you don't have to spend a lot of money to detect infringement, because that makes downstream commercialization more difficult. So an apparatus claim captures the actual thing, which means if, I don't know, Logitech or Microsoft copies my mouse and puts them on a store shelf, for me to detect infringement, all I have to do is, go to Amazon.ca or go to Best Buy, buy all the mice I see, and see if they're using the particular laser I've claimed or the ball I've claimed or what have you. So that's an apparatus claim. That's a claim for the actual thing. You can also have method claims, which are claims for operations or actions things or people are performing, right? So, there are a couple kinds of method claims using this mouse example. Maybe I should have picked a different example now that I'm thinking about it, but let's stick with it. So using the mouse example, you could have a method claim theoretically for someone using the mouse, right? Grabbing the apparatus, moving it on the screen, seeing the changing cursor, moving the cursor to an icon, double clicking, things like that. It sounds kind of silly, but it's theoretically possible. More to the point, though, that is a less desirable claim because that is directed at your customer as opposed to the competitor, right? So theoretically, if I only had that claim, I'd have to sue my customers to enforce, which is really not a great thing to do in business if you can avoid it. Another kind of method claim you could get in this example, which would be a little better, would be maybe you have a special mouse driver that runs on the computer that analyzes the mouse movements, right? Let's say that the refresh rate on the mouse is limited for some reason, and I really want to infer and up that refresh rate up because I'm a first-person shooter gamer and I need all the hertz I can get when it comes to refreshing my motion. So on the mouse driver side, maybe I do some kind of interpolation to figure out or to infer where this mouse cursor is between when the hardware is actually refreshing. And that I could actually capture as a method claim, not of what the user is doing, but what if the computer what the computer processor is doing when it's detecting the actual mouse movement. And that's a good claim too, because again, for discoverability, you can download the mouse driver off your competitor's website and see what it's doing. And then another kind of claim in this space would be what's called a computer readable medium claim. So that would be where it's not just a method, which is capturing something when the computer is doing it while it's doing it, but just the instructions itself in static form before it's being executed, right? So if I download the mouse driver and I'm not using the mouse, there is still literal infringement of what's going on because the computer readable medium claim says, whatever that method is, condensed into computer code and stored ready for execution, not necessarily just when it's actually being run. So those are different kinds of examples. And you'll see spins on that too. Like in the life sciences side, you'll see claims for compounds and compositions of matters and pharmaceutical drugs and things like that. Those are all fundamentally apparatus claims, just with more appropriate language. But ultimately, those are claims for the thing. You have method claims, which are claims for operations. And that's, fundamentally what you're going for.
And then if we abstract back, it's even more than that. Is like, who are you trying to sue if you're from an infringement perspective, right? And so, right, you've mentioned that sometimes it's the end user, right?
Yeah.
Hopefully it's not your customer, but it's some type of end user.
Sometimes.
Right? And so let's say in the business-to-business world, right? Like it's a business that you could sue, right? They have pockets, they have deep pockets, and it may be worthwhile to do so, right? And in some cases, you're like, okay, well, it's the company itself developing it and designing it, right? And you kind of mentioned this a little bit, but sometimes it's the manufacturer and going after that, right?
That's right. So I would say there are two big considerations, strategically when you're thinking along those lines. Who am I going to sue? Competitor, manufacturer, someone in the supply chain, end user, potentially customer. You may not, you won't want to sue your customer, but keep in mind the way these things actually play out, you may not actually have to take that customer to court, right? Like, you can have what's called induced infringement, where even if it's the customer who's infringing, you'll say, really, they're just following the directions of your competitor, therefore it's the competitor who's liable. In a business-to-business context, indemnities or warranties are very common, right? So maybe you do have to sue the customer, but the very first thing the customer will do is say, hey, supplier / my competitor, I've just gotten this suit, you need to step in now and take care of it. So you've sort of transferred from the customer to the competitor. So you want to include the different kinds of claims if they're potentially applicable, just to keep your options open.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. And the other thing, I said two things. The other thing would be discoverability, like I mentioned before, right? Are you even going to be able to find out someone's infringing? So you mentioned just now manufacturing method, totally potentially protectable, but you got to think if the manufacturing method, and in a software space, the analogy would be something like a SaaS product, right? You're doing stuff behind the scenes, and the stuff you release into the world, whether it's an end product or whether it's like a drug or something you manufacture, it's not a great example, an end product or a software functionality you're releasing via subscription, you may not be able to figure out behind the scenes what's going on to make that to make that product or to release the software. So that limits the value as well. And absent some good luck or good information sources, that would greatly reduce the value of your patent.
We struggled a lot with that when we were doing system claims in some type of communication environments where you sometimes it wasn't always done by a single individual, and so you had to collectively figure out how you could pull them together, because Some people were doing some of it, some other people were doing other parts of it. And
That's
sometimes you
right.
draft claims for like, okay, is it the person on the left? And then sometimes you draft claims for the person on the right.
That's a great point. I mean, it's who's infringing, right? And ideally, you don't want two different people whose actions need to be coordinated to infringe a single claim, right? Like if you have a server client architecture, you're going to draft it from the server perspective, or you're going to draft it from the client perspective. You're not going to draft it where one claim requires both people acting to do something, because then you can't sue anybody. You don't have a single person actually committing the act of infringement.
Yeah. And so how do you go through it? Like, so making this more practical, these are considerations that all companies need to decide as they're like, okay, I have this magic widget. Talk about the conversations you're having with your clients about extracting, right? What are the best approaches to focus your patent claims on?
Yeah, so I think it just starts with understanding the client's business and market and technology, right? I mean, so ideally, I mean, we're in the middle. This program, New Ventures BC, they deliver accelerated IP. There's also IP Assist. I think one of the good things about these programs is that they promote proactive conversations, so that if someone wants a quick call or wants to bounce an idea off me or I suppose anybody else, we've already had those strategic conversations. So I'll understand the business, understand the product, understand who the customers are, understand how they want to commercialize, and you can get to the point a lot faster, right? Yeah. Because those are the things you have to understand. If I get a cold call and it's, should I patent this or not? Okay, well, we're gonna have to talk for like 20 minutes before just so I can understand what you're actually going to do with it. It's a totally different answer if you're distributing software versus just making it available via subscription, right? It's a totally different answer if the product that you're manufacturing is reverse engineerable versus whether it's not. So you just got to understand the business. You got to understand the commercialization path, and go from there.
Yeah, and so it's really just building that relationship, you understanding both the technology and the market, and then building out a strategy that makes sense. Maybe just talk a little, sorry, actually, maybe just quickly, Chin, I do see your hand up. We are gonna maybe take questions at the end, but if it's something that we can incorporate into the conversation, please do write it in the chat, and we'll try to address it as we go along, but we'll try to save a little bit of time for questions at the end. Sorry, coming back, Roch, just maybe talk a little bit about, well, you don't have to file one application, right? Sometimes you're filing patent families or certain areas, collections of patent applications. How do you decide on that, right? And obviously, our audience today has a fair amount of cost considerations or limitations to consider. And so sometimes it makes sense to file one patent application. Sometimes it makes sense to file 5, right? How do you get to the crux of it? Understanding that, right, there's not unlimited funds.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think a very important driver there is money, right? Like how much do you want to, or can't, well, you probably don't want to spend anything, but how much can you reasonably allocate to this budget? And a lot of that goes to your age and stage of the company and what you're trying to accomplish, right? And how mature your technology is, right? So let's say you are a startup, you've got your core idea and you want to defer costs. A very typical thing to do in that situation is you draft a what's called a provisional application, and you file that. And a provisional application, really the key feature of that is, earlier in the talk, I said in order to get a patent for something, your invention has to be new and inventive relative to what's come before, right? And then the natural question is, before when? And the answer is before your filing date, so long as what you file fully describes your invention. So people will take and file their technology or their invention in a provisional application because that gets you a filing date. And it's called a provisional application because it's not going to be subsequently examined unless you file a subsequent non-provisional application within a year. So the provisional application secures you a filing date, but it's not going to be examined. And how long does it secure that filing date for you for? It secures it for 1 year. So if you're looking to defer costs, what you can do is draft that provisional, get a filing date for that core tech, which means if it's a good and well-drafted provisional, you could subsequently sell your invention, disclose it at a conference, advertise for it, without prejudicing your patent rights. And then at the end of that year, decide, do I want to now spend the money on a non-provisional application? And the whole point of that year is you can see how the market responds to your technology, right? Are you getting traction? Do you have orders coming in? Is it generating revenue? Is it still even valuable tech, right? Maybe you've invented something else that displaces it. Maybe someone else has. So patents are a lot like taxes. At the end of the day, there's no way to avoid paying, but you can stagger when you're going to pay based on what you want. So just to continue with this very common example, you come in, you've got some core tech. You're like, okay, well, let's file an application for that core tech. You file the provisional, it buys you a year. At the end of that year, you say, okay, well, you know what? My business is going pretty well. What am I gonna do now? And we have a conversation. Well, where do you want protection based on your market, based on your competitors, what have you? And people will often say, you know, I might get acquired by someone big. I think they file everywhere. I mean, no one files everywhere, but you think they file in a lot of places. I want to keep my options open, right? And then what is common is people will file what's called a PCT, or Patent Cooperation Treaty application. And that buys you two things. It buys you, from that 1 year mark, another year and a half where you don't have to file patent applications in the individual countries you want protection for, because that gets really expensive. And the second thing it buys you is it will buy you a preliminary patentability opinion from patent examiner. So you file this PCT application, you now get to defer further costs for a year and a half, so 2.5 years from your provisional filing date, and you get a preliminary patentability opinion there too. Which can inform your decision as to whether you actually want to spend the money to file in specific countries. So that would be one way to do it. You've got cost constraints, which means we've got to protect the core tech, but we got to do it in a smart and cost-deferred way. File the provisional, then file the PCT. You may be in a different stage of your development, right? Another thing that can often happen is, you know, maybe you've already got your provisional, and then you see, and you sold your product, and someone comes and copies it and steals it, right? And they're marketing that product and selling it right now, and they're taking your market share. And you may come and say, I've got patent pending, I want to sue them. To which my response would be, you can't. You need to actually get the patent before you sue. So instead of pushing out the costs, then you have to bring them forward because you need that patent fast. So a lot of countries, US, Canada, Europe, several others, will allow you to do that. You pay an extra fee, you pay to file a non-provisional right away, and you can get a patent theoretically in as quickly as, 6 months. So, my first example,
it's called accelerated examination.
Accelerated examination. So my first example, where you're doing provisional PCT, what's called national phase, when you file based off the PCT, you're looking 3 or 4 years before you get a patent, right? With accelerated examination, you could do it within 6 months. You condense the time, you condense the patent grant procedure, but you also bring forward the costs. So you got to kind of pick. If you're, sorry, I'm going to ramble, Byron. Do you
Well, no, and I think just like always focusing on the patent focus aspect is like, if you have a well-drafted provisional application, that gives you time to kind of go explore in the market. And so then you can decide, and you may have drafted claim sets within the provisional application, one focused on an apparatus, one focused on methods of manufacture, one focused on particular competitors, one set of claims focused on a number of different things that you may think may be novel or unique. And then you get that year to decide, okay, well, now that we're out in market and people are coming at us every which way, like which one do we want to move forward with?
Yeah, that's right. So that's another good strategy, right? Like if you're talking about cost deferral, you can have multiple different claim sets, either directed at claiming the same invention in different ways, like sort of how, with the mouse example, the apparatus or the method, or claiming different inventions. You can put them all in the same application and preserve your patent rights by filing a single application. Now, an examiner is not going to examine them all at once. The examiner will say, I see what you're trying to do here. You're trying to get me to do multiple times of the work, even though you're only paying me for one invention. No, thank you. And they'll issue what's called a unity rejection, and they'll say, pick one invention for this application, and if you want protection for the other ones, you got to file what's called a divisional application. Fine, you've still punted the cost of that divisional application till potentially as late as when your first application grants. So you've kicked it years down the road after funding, after an acquisition, right? While preserving your patent rights and while preserving the ability to bring those costs forward and bring patent grant forward if you need it.
And how often are you actually doing that with clients? Because obviously drafting the specification to think through that, or drafting claims and then having support within the specification through that will cost a certain amount. But like, does this happen? Like, from a discussion perspective, hey, I think I have 3 or 4 inventions, so to speak, but I don't have the ability to pay for all 4. Will you draft one and then just try and file it all in this single super application?
We'll try it sometimes. I would say it doesn't happen that often. I mean, primarily because a big, so of all the costs we're talking about, right? When we're talking about the cost of drafting and filing an application, you've got two cost components there, the drafting part and the filing part. And both can be expensive depending on where you are. But if you're going to file, if you're going to start with the provisional, the bulk of the cost is going to be the drafting cost, right? So, if that is the cost, and if that's the inhibitor, then if someone says, I want to patent 4 different inventions, but I only want to file one application for it, okay, the cost of filing 1 provisional versus 4 provisional, you're saving like $1,000. But the cost of drafting like the equivalent of 4 applications and putting into one, I mean, that could be, I mean, theoretically, it could be like tens of thousands of dollars. It usually isn't, because of course they're related. But you're adding multiple thousands of dollars up front. So it really is sort of a balancing act, right?
But you're buying time, to your comment though, right? So like if you're filing 4 provisional applications, each one of those has to be turned into a non-provisional within a year.
Yeah. And so there is the time thing. Like if you wanted to commercialize like all 4 and you put them all in the same application, well, then you've got the same 1-year clock running for all 4. And maybe you're not going to be ready in a year to go forward with all 4. Another thing is, keep in mind that provisional application, it's confidential for 1.5 years. But once it publishes, the whole thing publishes, not like half of it, right?
Yeah.
So if you only proceed with 1 invention because the other 3 aren't ready and you wanted to keep developing them, the whole application will publish. So all your technology will go out there. So I typically will say, hey, you know what? If you have like 4 different inventions and 4 different claim sets, what will usually happen is they're not totally different, right? They're usually related.
So we come back to like the mouse example, for example. Hey, I have a broad apparatus claim, and then I have a separate claim, right, for your driver.
I think the driver is a good example, right? Because really they're related but different inventions.
They're different.
Like the apparatus claim is capturing physical movement. The driver is processing the physical movement. But you could draft, like if you're drafting a specification, they naturally go hand in hand. So you could, for example, start with one specification where you describe just the hardware part and you claim the apparatus and you can file that. And then we just continue with the same specification and add the stuff about the driver, have a different claim set, and you can file that as a separate provisional. And then if you only wanted to proceed with, for example, the hardware, you wouldn't have to proceed with the other provisional directed at the driver, and that could stay confidential if you wanted it to.
Okay, so that's actually what you're talking about. You're talking about like the confidentiality. So because that's useful, I guess, because you're not releasing it into the public domain.
Yeah.
Okay. But then there is the risk that someone else does the same thing.
There is. There's always, so fundamentally, I mean, this is a patent focus, but at a high level, you got to choose. Am I going to patent it? From an IP perspective, you're choosing, am I going to patent it, or am I going to keep it a secret, or am I going to just forego IP protection in this thing, right? So let's forget forego. And then if it's just patent and trade secret, are you going to keep it a secret? In which case there's a risk someone else could patent and sue you. There are exceptions to that because you're a first user, but they are relatively limited and they vary with jurisdiction. In Canada, I don't think it's actually been tested. Our legislation is new. It might have been tested once. Versus you're gonna patent it, in which case you got to worry about the cost and you got to worry about someone infringing and potentially doing it without your noticing, or in a way that's not discoverable. You got to pick. And there are, like with all choices in life, there are pros and cons.
And I think the even additional thing to kind of think about from a patent focus perspective is sometimes you do want to disclose it. You're not going to move forward from a patent application, but you want it to be in the public domain. And so like you can file it in a patent application and then wait for it to be published. And then that's citable against any competitors.
That's right.
Or you can just file it on the internet as well. It's like kind of the discussion is.
So you just sort of described like the difference between offensive and defensive filings, right? The offensive ones are the important ones where you're going to focus a lot on those claims, because those are the ones that are directed at what you're actually making money off of, that you want to stop other people from doing. Whereas the defensive ones might just be, hey, you know what? This isn't our core business, but it would really suck if someone got a patent on that, because we might want to go down that road or sort of adjacent, or they could use that to compete with us de facto in the same market, even though it's not the same technology. And then you can publish that either through the patent system or, date it, put it in a white paper or a journal on your website. The one nuance I'll describe there is something I've started doing recently, is I have noticed, in fact, more often than not, when I've noticed that my clients, when they go into China and they'll deal with Chinese manufacturers, almost like the majority of the time where we've even discovered it, the Chinese manufacturer has filed their own patent application domestically in China for our client's IP. And the Chinese examiner doesn't care that there may be an English publication on a website somewhere, and that can cause issues. So one thing I've done a few times, cost permitting, is you can actually file in China earlier, maybe concurrent or shortly after your provisional, so that if that supplier does file in China, there'll be a Chinese version of your patent application that the examiner can hopefully find and cite, as opposed to you finding out 2 or 3 years down the road that someone else patented your invention and you're sort of just in a bad place to start.
Yeah, that's really fascinating and interesting advice. I hadn't heard that, but that's a bit frightening, to be honest.
I got tired of suppliers doing it.
And so maybe just taking this back, and we're going to continue on, but from a focus perspective, right? Our audience needs to think about a number of different considerations, right? Are you looking at the patent system as an offensive or defensive way of protecting yourself? Who are you looking to go after? If it does issue a patent, right? Are you going after a competitor? Are you going after a manufacturer? Are you going after like your end users, right? And how do you want to kind of draft those applications? And these are all considerations you need to work with your patent agent with, your patent lawyer with, and consider with intention, right, as you go through that process, because it can make a huge difference. And maybe we'll get to some examples about this at different for different types of companies, because like I'm sure you have seen enforcement be affected by decisions you made when drafting the application.
Oh yeah, sure.
Okay, so we talked a little bit about claim types. We talked a little bit about claims itself. We talked about cost considerations. We talked about strategies. Maybe talk a little bit about sector focus and vertical specific considerations. I know timing, right, is a very company specific and sector specific consideration. How do different types of companies need to think about it, and how may it change your patent focus?
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, let's touch off on biotech or life sciences, again, with the caveat that I don't personally practice in that area. I know sort of generally what the concerns are in contrast to the physical sciences or computer sciences. So they are quite different. So with biotech, one issue is my invention actually going to work, right? Like a lot things that are alive are unpredictable. So often you need, you can't just manufacture a drug or some other compound and say, I know that's going to work. There's a reason clinical trials exist. But to perform a clinical trial, you have to distribute your invention and carry it forward. So you want to patent earlier, but there's that utility requirement for patents, which means you have to be confident at least, or have a reasonable basis to conclude that your compound's actually going to work. So how do you balance that? When do you do the trial versus when do you actually file and satisfy the legal requirements? That's one issue. Another would be just strategically for pharmaceutical or a lot of life sciences innovations, the term at the end of a patent is more important than the term at the beginning, because you got to go through the regulatory clearances and hurdles, right? There's literally litigation for some drugs as to when we say patents expire 20 years from filing, do we mean at 12:01 a.m. or do we mean 11:59 p.m.? Because sometimes for a life sciences innovation, that those royalties are so high, it literally makes sense to litigate over a single day. So that's what you're concerned with. It's also depending on your innovation. I mean, we're going to focus on a drug again. It can be harder to design around a patent for a particular drug, because you're not just dealing with the legal concern, you're dealing with a regulatory concern, right? It's not like you can just change a drug a lot of times and say, I've got a different drug, here, everybody take it. You got to go through the same very expensive regulatory process. So those are some characteristics and issues to consider with life sciences or biotech filings. In the spaces that I'm more familiar with, so physical engineering, computer sciences. So let's deal with AI, for example. I mean, software generally, but AI is a big component of software right now. Like I said, what are big things to consider? Discoverability. How are competitors going to commercialize this AI, right? Are they actually going to distribute a product, or is it all going to be behind the scenes? In which case, if it's a subscription product, will you know how they're training their model? Will you know what data they used? Will you know when they improve it? Will you know when they change an architecture? Probably not, right? So that can tend towards let's not do it. But that can be contrasted with, you may have certain applications where it makes a lot of sense to file. If you're, for example, in the self-driving car space, and you're going to literally have to install the software on every car that you sell, that is something where you could buy the car, experiment with it, look at the sensors, and see what's going on. So it's a different consideration, right? And then overlaid, kind of particularly on AI, is this culture of publication. There is a lot of publication that goes on in this space, right? And from a legal perspective, even if you weren't going to otherwise file, once you've published, there's no longer a legal downside. So then the legal downside goes away. You're just thinking about time and money. I totally get it. Those are important, but the legal considerations change, right? Because you're no longer going to be able to rely on trade secret if you're going to publish it anyway. So those are some of the AI considerations. I mean,
what about subject matter questions, right? I know historically, right, and the Patent Act itself says algorithms are not patentable.
Right.
AI in some respects is just an algorithm. How are the courts looking at this? How are patent drafters looking at this? And right, what are things our audience should be thinking about, right, as they're having conversations with their patent lawyers about if they're trying to file or protect AI inventions?
So there's still guidance coming out, like in the AI space in particular. There was just a decision released by the UK Court of Appeal 1 or 2 weeks ago. Around the same time, the USPTO, the US Patent Office, just released some guidance on examination. The European Office has been releasing some appellate decisions. The bottom line, if I'm going to boil it down, is you want a technical improvement implemented by the software, affected by the software. And what I say is the closer to the metal you get, the easier it is to get a patent. Right? So if you're able to very closely tie your software to some kind of, for example, hardware-based improvement, if you were going to say, you know what, this AI model, when I'm normally running it, requires 85 GPUs, and I've now got it running same performance at 30 GPUs, that is something where there's a very strong case for patentability, because you've tied the software to an actual hardware benefit, right? A level above that, the arguments are a little tougher, but still very commonly successful, right? If you're looking at firmware or stuff with a very strong technical effect, encryption is your classic example there, right? Clearly very technical, lots of practical implications, lots of concerns with respect to how strong the encryption is, how long it may take to overcome. Again, if you can tie it to a technical effect, good case for patentability. Image processing too, stuff like that. Where you're taking images in, you're trying to analyze what's in it, you're doing very low-level computations as to how to make it suitable for a particular product. Maybe you can actually demonstrate, I've got the security system and I've got these images, and if I process it one way, by the time the processing is done, the crime's finished. Or I'm only able to detect a criminal 20% of the time, and you've changed it to get faster response time, so maybe you can actually catch them in the middle of the crime, which would be nice. Or you've got better resolution or better identification or matching for subsequent use. Again, good case there. But if you go a lot higher, if you go to like application level, I kind of say half tongue in cheek, I've talked a lot of people who've invented an iOS app out of getting a patent because it's just kind of pointless, right? Like if you've got something at the application level, it's relying on existing APIs. It's not really doing anything novel technically. It may be cool, valuable functionality. Maybe I want to know how many glasses of water I drink in a day. Fantastic. But I would not try getting a patent for that. So that is sort of the contrast there. You want to increase your odds of getting a software-based patent. You want technical effect. You want close to the metal. And it's a sliding scale. It's not a hard black and white litmus test. I wish it were. It's just not. Yeah. So that's sort of what you're working with.
Yeah, and so definitely it's a conversation with your lawyer to ensure that, right, you're understanding where things are now and also where they're going. Because I think that's another aspect. That's another thing that I saw with a number of clients is, all right, well, this is where the rules, and then 5 years later, a court case came out and said, okay, well, everything we drafted 5 years ago is now useless.
Yeah, absolutely. There is. Take it with a grain of salt. The U.S. Congress proposes many laws that they don't pass, but there's a law right now called a bill right now called the Restore Act, which aims to broaden subject matter eligibility. Right? What's the likelihood of it passing? I don't know, but it's a comment, like it comes up all the time because lots of people will complain about it.
And that's kind of the exciting space. Like it's an exciting part of the patent world right now is they're really at the leading edge, and so like everything, the law is always trying to catch up. And so
Yeah.
It's more kind of a theoretical or kind of a philosophical question about what you can and cannot patent. But definitely on the AI side right now and its effect on people, right, the planet, right, still TBD on what's going to be
Yeah.
allowable or not.
The guidance is new. Like I said, the guidance from the US it's under a month old. The UK case is under a month old. It's happening now.
Yeah. Last thing on maybe vertical specific, and I know we do have some of our audience members who are coming and spinning out of university research. Any kind of specific considerations on the patent focus side for university related innovations?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, first of all, you should know what your university's IP policy is. Different universities will have different policies, right? Some universities will say that if you are employed by us and use any of our facilities, then the university will own the IP. Some others will say you will own the IP even if you used university facilities, but we may be able to help you commercialize. And if we help you commercialize, then we'll take a share. You have to pay us something. Even the universities that own the IP may not be interested in it. So if you have a good relationship with your university industry liaison office, your ILO there, you may be able to talk with them, figure out kind of quickly, are they going to have an interest or not? And if they are, get their help. And if they're not, maybe you take it and you run with it, right? You have to worry as well about those policies. There are several times where clients will think they're clear of the policy, but they're in fact not, at least from the ILO's perspective. So I encourage clients to have a free and frank discussion, like have a good relationship with the ILO and just talk with them. Because you may think they're wrong, but what you think is only going to count for so much if you're going through a round of investment and the ILO does not think they're wrong, right? And you really want to avoid that. And the sooner you avoid it, the better.
Yep. And I think right now there's also like a big push for a lot of universities across Canada to talk about alternative revenue streams. Universities are always looking for cash coming in through the door. And so licensing is a big thing for, I know, a number of different universities. And so claims or opportunities to be able to license technology out and maybe drafting in a way that is easy for a potential licensor to think about, right? Or to sign off on may be helpful. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I mean, I think they would apply all the stuff we've been talking about. Like there's not a special claiming way, but because even when we draft without a university context, you're focused on commercialization, but absolutely they're there to commercialize.
Yeah. Just a couple of questions that are coming through the chat. I think maybe worthwhile. One, right, since we are talking about this relationship and usefulness between a patent lawyer and the client, one of the questions just talks about fee estimation, and not necessarily that's really focused on focus, but right, if someone you give a quote, right, that it'll cost this much, and then as you get into it, they're like, okay, well, we want to have a super application that's talking about a number of different inventions, right, but only claim one set, and so the fees may go up. When are you having that conversation, and how are you ensuring that people are not, or how should clients expect you are having that conversation, and so they're not surprised by a bill at a later time?
Yeah, I guess it depends on the lawyer and your relationship with them, right? Like some lawyers still take the approach, just bill it and see what happens. I'm not personally a fan of that approach. I just think it's counterproductive. The way I'll typically work is, you give a quote range in the beginning just based on experience. And if stuff happens that deviates from that experience, it's going to increase the quote. You have the discussion earlier rather than later, and you give the client a choice, right?
Yep.
So the typical way that will happen, which is common, which I always encourage, I expressly will tell clients not to do this, is you sort of get the initial technical disclosure in drips and drabs, right? Like if you get the first disclosure and you're like, here's your draft application, we're right on budget. And then you come back and you say, actually, I also want to protect X, Y, Z. The original quote no longer applies because there's a lot more additional stuff that has been provided halfway through the drafting process, right? Which means not only are you dealing with more volume, but you've got to sort of rearrange the stuff in the original draft and make it all fit. So I think you want as a client to turn your mind initially. I just want to make this streamlined. I want to understand what my invention is. Here is the disclosure. Now it's frozen. Now it's done. We can work with it, right? If there's something unclear, we can clarify it. But you don't want to be sort of providing it slowly over time. And then, you know, you check in and you have a good relationship there. There are lots of times I've had clients and I'm like, hey, you know what, this actually did end up more expensive. And I'm not saying all lawyers will do this. I'll just like, wait, what do you want me to do? Like, what do you want me to, like, what do you think is fair here? I mean, I didn't give you a heads up. I'll stick with the original quote. That's fine. Or, you know, if I'm being totally objective and reasonable, this is what I think it's worth. But you know what? Personally, I'm not in the business of arguing with clients. And you know, if you just gotta, as a client, also know that, you know, be cognizant of the amount of work you're creating and try to make it streamlined.
Yeah, and this is definitely a discussion that was had in previous webinars, ensuring that you're providing all of the information at one time, and same advice. I would say and this is when I was a practitioner, the most annoying thing too is when someone gives you something else, you're like, and people don't understand, is like most lawyers don't draft their own figures. So most have some, I don't know if you do it in-house or not, but like we had an agency that would draft our thing. So we would draw it by hand. This is what we want it to look like. And then we would send it out. And so not only does that increase or sometimes double the cost of the figures, but also it's like, well, that might take a week. And so if we were trying to file and hit a deadline, now it's really difficult because like I'm not in control of when the figures are drafted. Right? Or you get really ugly figures because I have to hand draw them myself.
Yeah, I mean, there are third parties,
Yeah.
and that can come up. I mean, you know, you file it with a hand-drawn figure if you're up against the wall, and then you file an amendment after. And that's I hopefully you can avoid that.
Yeah. But I guess that to respond to the question is like that, have that conversation. This is just about, right? It's expectation management, and this happens on both sides from a client perspective, right? Startups are busy. Right? Something comes in, right? Obviously, teams are not necessarily the most organized sometimes, and so have that conversation with your lawyer, right? And hopefully, you'll be able to come to kind of
I mean, I'd say don't be afraid to talk about it, right? Raise it, and if you think reasonably something's going on, don't you know? The advice goes both ways. Don't just sort of send and hope, right? For the lawyer and for the client, just try to proactively deal with it.
I know we're running out of time, and so please do keep sending questions. We'll go a little bit longer because there's a couple of more things that we want to get to. And I would comment that I know we had booked an hour, but this presentation will be up on YouTube later on. And so if you do need to drop, you'll have the opportunity to kind of catch whatever you missed on the New Ventures BC YouTube channel at a later time. So kind of moving on, maybe just keeping it practical, like talk a little bit about maybe some of the examples you've had with different clients of different sizes, right? Maybe I'll just quickly say, right, there's like the startups, there's the scale-ups, there's kind of more established companies. Any special considerations that from a patent focus perspective, you've seen as a pattern that you can share with our audience today?
Yeah, so I think the startup stuff, you know, I talked a lot about it when we were talking about the cost deferral aspect. I mean, that is certainly a big consideration. You don't have a lot of money. You want to preserve your rights while deferring costs. You can very often do the provisional, then PCT, and then further deferral. Also, in terms of the tech, you're typically starting with a core innovation. It's not like you've got 3 or 4 or 5 different things often that you want to patent. It's like, we got the thing, and we want to protect the thing. So you're often, I mean, there are always exceptions. You're often starting with like a single application for a single invention. You're looking to defer costs. The thing with a scale up, the considerations change. Well, usually you have more innovation. That is where you might have a bunch of things happening in parallel. And frankly, you might be willing to spend more money, right? Because you're scaling up, you got revenue coming in through the door, and you're preparing yourself for future rounds of financing, and you want to make your IP portfolio attractive to larger players.
And this also includes in more geographies as well. Like we didn't really talk about this, but that is a consideration for lots of scale-ups and for lots of established companies.
That's right. So not just number of applications you're drafting, but where you are actually filing, right? So, you know, if you're going to scale up and you want to, you may be at the point in a scale up where you're 2.5 years that I referenced earlier for a PCT application where that's up, right? And you've got to now file in particular jurisdictions. And maybe it's a scale up that does justify filing in, you know, 5, 6, 7 places. Whereas if you were a startup, you wouldn't file in 7 places. You know, maybe just pick the US and Canada or something like that. So both, you're right, in terms of geography and number of applications, and also some other, not just in protecting your own rights, but in freedom to operate. So particularly with scale ups, where I find in particular like medical devices, clean technology, where there's a lot of a lot of capital investment upfront that results in tangible products where infringement is easily detected, and where the patent system kind of works pretty well. A lot of investors will say, we want to see that you've done some diligence, that you're not infringing anyone else's patent, and we're not just going to take your word for it. So you may also spend some time and money doing that kind of clearance work. And then if you've got a very large company, let's say you're not worried about scaling up. You've scaled up, right? You don't need to attract more financing. You've got a good revenue stream. There could be a lot of maintenance. You probably are still doing new filings, but you probably also have a mature enough portfolio that you're looking at just abandoning or culling the patents that aren't worth anything to you anymore. Keep in mind, when you do that, they still serve a defensive purpose, right? They'll still stop people from patenting the same thing. You just can't enforce them anymore, but maybe it doesn't matter. And these things add up when you get big portfolios, right? A few $100 a year in isolation, not a big deal. A few $100 a year times 100 starts to become a big deal. And then also, not to get too much into the weeds, from an offensive side, if you're a larger player, you may be able to afford, and you may do this when you're not just a big player. It's a good strategy called, in the US, a continuation strategy. So you may get an allowance in the US, and you may say, this is a really valuable patent. I've gotten claims that are granted, but you know what? I think I'm entitled to a little more. I think I can get a little more, even though these claims are okay for what I'm doing. Or I think these claims are really good, but I can never totally predict how someone's going to tweak this core tech. So I'm going to file another application called a continuation, which is entitled to the very first filing date you have, if that disclosure has been there the whole time, where you can still have an application pending that you can amend. So that means if someone comes along and infringes your tech and they come up with this clever, unforeseeable non-infringement argument, or they tweak their design a bit, but they tweak it in a way that's still supported in your originally filed application, you can amend those claims, still capture what they're doing, and keep your enforcement options alive.
Yeah. And often you'll see of that are continuation in parts where you might have specific embodiments that you may want to include in that application. And so if you have enough disclosure to be able to file it just as a continuation, kind of these very narrow embodiments, you just kind of throw in as a continuation in part, and you can protect that as well.
Yeah, you can do that too.
Yeah. And so lots of different ways to kind of think about that, right? As you kind of grow and scale, right? I would say also as you're getting larger, like you're often seeing companies bring certain IP in-house, and then there's a discussion about how, right, you're supporting, right, in-house counsel through that work. Maybe any discussions there? I don't know if you have many clients who have kind of in-house IP specialists.
Oh yeah, I think it's a good idea too. And not just, I mean, if you're a large company, then you probably do have some kind of in-house lawyer or patent agent, right? Whose sole job it is to attend development meetings, liaise with outside counsel. They might do the work themselves and outsource as necessary. But if you're smaller, you probably can't afford that, nor is there really a justification for it, right? So what I usually tell clients is you should have someone whose responsibility the IP portfolio is, right? They should be the point person, so that outside counsel is not wasting time and money, because that is where, if you're going to use outside counsel, look, there's no way around it. We're expensive. You want us to do efficient things, right? You don't want us trying to herd cats. So if you've got a whole bunch of different inventors who, with post-COVID remote work, are in 3 or 4 different time zones, you want to be able to liaise with them and corral them yourself, so that all you're getting from us is an email from, a paralegal saying, here are the documents, please arrange for execution by this date, as opposed to a lot of back and forth. And then that point person as well, over time, they will develop a skill set. So I've worked with some clients, it's the longest clients I've worked with, probably 14, maybe 16 years now. And they've had one person in that role, not for the whole 16 years, but for the bulk of it. And they are really good now, right? Like they've just learned over time, and they're saving their company a lot of money, like thousands of dollars per application, by sending me something that I can work with and start with that's like half done, right? So that is a skill set they've developed internally.
Yeah. And I mean, you definitely see that a lot on the bioscience side, on the biotech side, where, right, kind of as part of a larger just corporate strategy, IP is almost like the instrumental part, right? If you're building innovator drugs, like if you don't have IP, you're kind of dead in the water. And so having those internal IP specialists early on is a playbook that we see all the time.
Yeah.
And so I guess if we just abstract back is, right, IP needs to be part of an overall strategic plan for an organization. You need to have a clear thought on how patents are going to play an important or a less important role, a more important role or a less important role,
Yeah.
as part of your either go-to-market strategy or your defensive strategy, particularly if you're in sectors that are particularly litigious or also prone to like NPEs, like is another thing from that perspective is like we're definitely seeing that continue to be an issue, especially if you're kind of selling into the US in certain types of categories.
Yeah, NPE. So those are patent trolls, which most of you probably heard about, where their businesses exist only to sue other people. And I agree that in the US, they're not as big as a problem as they were like 12, 13 years ago, but they're still a problem. I mean, I think it's absolutely correct. I will say another thing that I think is good about the IP Assist and Accelerated IP programs, I hope continues, is you do have a lot of proactive strategic discussions, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where you can frame the business, you can integrate the IP into the overall business strategy as opposed to sort of retroactively fit it. Like I do have, not uncommonly, conversations where someone said, we're going through a round of funding. This is what we've done. What's our IP strategy? Okay, so now we're kind of reverse engineering the IP strategy onto what's actually been done so we can present a coherent picture to potential investors. Sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't work, right? But it's not ideal. You want the choice. So having a proactive discussion in advance saying, what are we going to do here and why is a good idea.
Okay, yeah, for sure. And I think that's just good advice in general is ensure that as you're working with your investors or as you're working with your board or as you're working with your lawyers, that you're being open and transparent about like what are the objectives that you're trying to achieve, and then right, get advice from all the different sides to ensure that everyone is kind of pointed and heading in the same direction. We are running up on time. Chin, maybe what we'll do is is Roch maybe generous enough to provide his contact information, and you can maybe write to him directly, or you can write to Accelerate IP and they'll forward the question or connect it to us. But I just want to give Roch maybe just the last couple of minutes to kind of share any final words of advice as our audience is, we need to wrap up, but our audience is kind of interested in this patent-focused discussion.
Yeah, I think my final words of advice, I mean, carrying on the discussion we just had, is I would take advantage of whoever your external advisors are. I mean, I'll talk about the patent lawyers because that's who I am and we're a patent focus, but not just that, as Byron said. Take advantage of their experience, have those proactive strategic discussions, right? Like that is where I think, can provide a lot of value. You know, you do the job for almost 20 years, you see a lot of situations of what has worked, what hadn't worked in different situations, in different scenarios. And I think you'll get a lot more value out of your counsel then than if it's simply do this one thing for me, just this one thing, and I'll tell you sort of after the fact what I want done. That is fine. That is fine too, right? Like that, there's a purpose for that, and that is good. But I think you're sort of shortchanging yourself if you're only having those conversations, right? Like have the proactive, high-level strategic conversations, and then follow up with, okay, this is tactically how we're going to execute. Blah 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 blah. But have the higher value ones too.
Yeah, and I would say I see that all the time. That there is so much value being able to talk to a specialist and be able to understand what the landscape looks like and what are opportunities. And you're definitely shortchanging your relationship with like amazing practitioners across a number of different fields, and not just lawyers, but a lot of different service providers. If you're not trying to leverage and engage on areas where they have particularly unique knowledge that may be able to help you. And so that's why there are programs like this available, right? And so to your comment, IP Assist through IRAP, or Stream 1, Stream 2, or Stream 3 through the Accelerate IP, or Elevate broadly, the National Elevate IP program, are all meant to kind of help level up startups across Canada and ensure that we're thinking about ways of being more productive, but also protecting, right, the amazing innovation that is coming out of our country.
Yeah, there's a great ecosystem here. I mean, a great ecosystem of clients and companies, and a great ecosystem of practitioners. I mean, I'm biased, but you know, you get lots of companies going. You can use an attorney anywhere in a globalized world, but Americans are super expensive with the exchange rate and the nominal rates, and frankly, with an apology to any American attorney on the call, I think we're better. I think we're better because I think that we're more attuned to the local market. there are lots of times where I'll get, you know, a note from a client that was using a US firm, and when you have a $25 trillion economy, you can just focus on the US. Whereas, you know, your Canadian practitioners tend to have a more Canadian-centric view of the world, which is, okay, let's focus on your markets elsewhere as well and get you the whole picture, you know, generally at a more reasonable cost than if you're retaining someone in the Bay Area, which is, yeah, I get shocked by the bills. So that's my last practical advice. If I'm shocked by the bills,
I've definitely been shocked by lots of bills as well. Okay, so I just want to thank you for joining, Roch. This was a fun conversation, and thanks to our audience for participating and sticking with us through today. If they want to contact you, how do they do so?
You can Google me, find my name and contact information on the Gowling website. Here, I'll put my email address in the chat. You can just click that and email me too.
There you go. And so with that, I'll hand it back to Bradley for final words and wrap up.
Thanks so much, Roch and Byron, for today's chat. Really exciting, really interesting things going on. Like Byron mentioned, we will be putting a recording of this session on YouTube, so check that out if there's anything you missed or if there's anything you want to review. Also, keep an eye out for our next speaker series. We'll be doing several more of these over the course of the year, so please stay tuned for that. But I'll leave it here for now. Have a great day, everyone. Take care.